Welcome to Season 1, Episode 7 of A Story Club Global Cultures. This is a unique venture. It's streaming simultaneously from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, Dehra Dun in India, and San Francisco in the United States. We speak with people from around the world, trying to understand different cultures, their uniqueness, their problems and their issues, and how we can all learn and work together while remaining grounded in our distinctive cultural matrices. Today's episode is titled European Paganism, Spirituality, and Anti-Imperialism. My guest is Christopher McIntosh, author of several books on the subject of paganism, secret societies, esoteric traditions, and nature-oriented belief systems. He's also a former information officer with the United Nations Development Program and UNESCO. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Kirk. Pleasure to be here.
Yes. I'd like to just set up our discussion with a little introduction first, and then I'll invite you to speak more fully on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, what is the hidden history of European paganism? What is it? What does it mean? How has it survived centuries of Christian dominance, prejudice, and hostility? What are its connections to other cultures of the world, in particular the wider Indo-European culture, and also the world that Europe colonized? Is paganism a subculture of hippies and nonconformists that has no place in responsible modern society? Or are we actually unaware of the power of the European pagan traditions and its survivals through Greco-Roman culture, the arts, science, and philosophy, or through secret societies, and also persisting European folk traditions? The way that these things have shaped the modern world and may actually contribute to a more harmonious world. It is these issues and more that I look very much forward to discussing with our expert guest, Christopher McIntosh. So, Christopher, could you tell us about your interest and your work in the European pagan and in the esoteric tradition, and how these came to interest you? I think the audience would very much like to know that.
Well, I have a very long and roundabout path behind me to get to where I am now. I was born in England in 1943 and grew up largely in Scotland, Edinburgh. And I studied at Oxford University, philosophy, politics and economics, and then German at London University. And then later on, I returned to Oxford to take a doctorate in history on the subject of Rosicrucianism. Career-wise, I worked for a long time in journalism and publishing in London. And I was fortunate enough to live in and around London in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when London was a fantastic center of esotericism and occultism, especially during the 70s and 80s, when in the part of London that I was living, there was a remarkable community of people interested in these things. And there were two particular houses where there were all kinds of occult activities going on. And I became, to some extent, actively involved. I was for a time in a group that was practicing ritual work, more or less in the Golden Dawn tradition. And I made some marvelous friends during that period, very lasting friendships. And two friends in particular influenced me in my path towards paganism. One was Freya Aeswin, who went on to become an expert on the runes and the Nordic tradition in general. And the other was Hilmar Ørn Hilmersen, who is now head of the pagan community in Iceland, the Asatru community. But I wasn't yet a fully card-carrying pagan, so to speak, at that time. That came a bit later.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in 1989, I emigrated to America, and I worked for 4 years in New York at the, as you mentioned, at the United Nations Development Program. And while I was in New York, I had a couple of revelatory experiences. One was looking back at Europe from the vantage point of New York. I realized that I'm basically a North European, and the Nordic gods and goddesses are my gods and goddesses, the deities of Northern Europe. And the second experience was, well, at that time, my then wife was Jewish, and we used to sometimes attend a synagogue. And one evening, I was attending a lecture by the rabbi, and he was talking about the differences between monotheism and polytheism. And he said, you know what the difference is? He said, in monotheism, everything proceeds in a straight line. History proceeds in a straight line towards the second coming, the promised land, the last judgment, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always moving forward in a straight line. Whereas in polytheism, in the pagan traditions, everything moves in a great circle.
Mm-hmm.
And at that moment, I had a flash of realization that I'm a man of the circle, not the straight line.
Yes.
So I think that was then I moved back to Europe, briefly to London, and then to Germany to work for UNESCO in Hamburg. And I then became actively involved in pagan circles and started to celebrate the seasonal festivals. And I had a profound feeling of homecoming,
Mm-hmm.
that this was my tradition, this was where I belonged.
Yeah.
So that's where I am now.
Right. There's a lot of questions and tangents I'd like to move from that story you had. Very interesting things. Even just the first one. Our first prime minister here in Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, was a great historian scholar trained at Oxford. And he was also a Rosicrucian.
Ah, yes.
He had a Rosicrucian burial.
Oh, did he?
Yes. And he was in power here for 30 years straight.
Really?
Yeah, and took us through independence and the first years of independence, and became very controversial in some ways. In other ways, worshipped as almost a god by his followers. But I was wondering, did you become a Rosicrucian at Oxford? Because I was wondering if maybe that's how Eric Williams himself, like maybe there's a strong Rosicrucian presence in Oxford.
No, not really. I doubt whether he became a Rosicrucian at Oxford. And I've never described myself as a Rosicrucian. It was a tradition that interested me and still does,
right,
as an important tradition in European history,
right,
which has had a very
for people who don't know what Rosicrucianism is. I'm not an expert on it, but I understand it to be one of these sort of secret elite societies, like Freemasonry, very similar, having hidden traditions, probably going back to the Knights Templar and the Crusades, and having this hidden knowledge brought back from the East during that time. Am I correct in that thinking, or no?
Well, the thing is, one has to distinguish between the mythology of Rosicrucianism and the historical facts. The historical facts are that it started around the beginning of the 17th century when some manifestos were published in the Tübingen area of Germany. And these manifestos told the story of a man called Christian Rosenkreuz, Christian Rose-Cross,
Right.
who, according to these accounts, made a journey around the Middle East as a young man. And he went via Arabia along the North African coast to Fez in Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way, he gathered the knowledge and wisdom from the wise men of that region. And then he returned to Germany, and on the basis of the knowledge that he'd acquired, he established a brotherhood.
Okay.
And he then eventually died at a very old age and was buried in a vault. And but the brotherhood continued, and after a certain time, the brethren rediscovered the vault, which had been hidden for a time. And in this vault, they found all kinds of objects, and the walls of the vault were covered with astrological and alchemical symbols. So this vault became an important symbol of the Rosicrucian movement. Well, but the thing is, we don't know whether Christian Rosenkreuz actually existed, or whether the whole thing was a kind of fiction in a way, designed to launch certain ideas into the consciousness of Europe. At any rate, right. The idea was to launch a vision, a holistic vision.
And what year was this?
Well, this would have been, these three manifestos were published 16, 14, 15, and 16.
Oh, okay. So that's before the English Revolution, even. Okay.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. And yeah. What they were putting forward basically was a kind of holistic vision, bringing together science, religion, and the arts. Mm-hmm. And so this is really what is at the center of Rosicrucianism. Now, whether this brotherhood actually existed is another question. But right. The thing is, after these manifestos were published, many people came forward, either defending the brotherhood or attacking it or claiming to be members of it.
Were they persecuted by the crown or not? Was it tolerated?
Some of them were persecuted. Yes, some of them right. were thrown into prison.
Right.
And so there was what was called the Rosicrucian furor.
Yeah.
Which followed the publication of these manifestos. And but the thing is that it started a whole process where many people claimed to be the inheritors of the true Rosicrucian tradition. So you had a whole proliferation of different groups
right.
calling themselves Rosicrucian, and that has continued up to today.
Right.
In fact, there are any number of groups that use the word Rosicrucian.
Right. And it's amazing to me when I first started to investigate this, when you start to look at the history of science, the history of philosophy, the history of the arts, how much and the Renaissance, for example, a lot of the Renaissance was going back to the Greco-Roman tradition, and I suppose rejecting the church's teaching or going beyond outside of it and taking influence from all these so it helped in terms of the artwork, it helped in terms of scientific exploration, chemistry, all these things that were so the greatest scientific minds were members of these societies that were drawing back on the ancient pagan knowledge. Correct?
Yeah, yes. Well, a very good example is Isaac Newton.
Mm-hmm.
Isaac Newton.
Yes.
Who is really the last great scientist who was at the same time involved in the Hermetic tradition.
Yes.
It was really the last occasion when one could be a great scientist and be a proponent of those traditions.
Yes, yes, yes. And an interesting sort of point of similarity between you and I think is my own training was also in development studies, and and to this day, you know, development in the third world, and you know, it's what I've devoted my life to. But I'm also interested in all these other subjects, and throughout my life, from when I was a university student at the University of Toronto, and started to question the whole development project itself, and wondering if this whole idea is to make the world just another version of America, and you know, this kind of and then later on I would develop into a sort of critique of materialism, and this thing that we all want to have these, you know, very materialist societies, and that you know, isn't that a sort of imperialism in and of itself? I know in the earlier discussions we've had, we spoke about, you were speaking about the Kalahari Bushmen, and so could you elaborate on that for us, for our audience?
Yeah. Well, I think in many ways the United Nations and similar organizations do a great job. For example, in the area of international regulations for shipping, for air traffic, so that safety regulations are observed worldwide, ease of communication. And when you think of international telephone codes, for example, that we can telephone all over the world using the same codes, that there are international postal codes, international time zones, international copyright laws. All these things are thanks to the United Nations and related organizations, and they help to keep the world running smoothly. The problem is when these organizations try to impose a certain model of development worldwide, and this is where the problem is, that there's a danger that you're going to end up trying to turn the whole world into the model of a suburban shopping mall.
Yes.
You know, where you park in some hideous multi-story car park, and you go in and you find the same shops that you see all over the world, the same goods on sale, you eat the same junk food, you hear the same anodyne music being played in the background to lull you into being a passive consumer.
And you watch the same Marvel movies and use the
exactly.
same iPhones.
Exactly. So that's not the kind of model we want.
Yes. I think I remember in our last conversation too, it's very interesting to note. I mean, I remember when I was growing up in Toronto, and I mean, the Native American, the First Nations community, as they call them in Canada, they have a relatively strong presence, especially in the northern 2/3 of the country. They could be 50% to much greater of the population, because it's very sparsely populated. Most of Canada lives on the border with the United States. But so First Nations issues can become very big, especially for that part of Canada. And they would be, you know, criticizing various developments and encroachments on their land. And they had problems of alcoholism, underdevelopment, etc. And I used to think to myself, I don't understand. Nothing is preventing these, you know, First Nations people from just coming to Toronto or Montreal, participating in life like everybody else, and and being part of the developed first world, but they want to stay on their reservations, and I don't understand that. Why? And I really could not wrap my head around it as a young person growing up
Yeah.
in the dominant ideology. And it's only later on I realized that that they're just like how you describe with your profound connection with the Northern European gods, and it happened in my own life.
Yeah.
Sorry. My own profound connection with the Hindu gods, and with
Yeah.
Trinidad and Tobago, and why I left there, and wanted to connect back to the roots of my family, and my ancestry and history, and so forth. And I understood it with them. And I think you made the point that a lot of times when you take like a Kalahari Bushman and you put them in the city, they become alcoholics,
They
or
become
have some
alcoholics.
addiction problem.
Yes.
Yeah. Why don't you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. Well, you see, the people in the international development industry have a certain conception of what it means to be modern and progressive. That it has to do with life expectancy, level of education, health, technological level of technology, and so on. But if you apply that to the Kalahari Bushmen, they wouldn't even be on the scale, because they live in absolute poverty. They have a low life expectancy. They have no education, and they only live on what they can hunt and gather. And yet they have a wonderfully rich culture. They have an oral culture going back probably 1,000 or more years. A wonderful, a rich musical culture, a very refined sort of social set of social norms. And so, are you doing them a favor by taking them out of their natural environment and putting them in a house with running water? You increase their life expectancy, but as you say, they're going to fall into depression and take to drink.
They lose meaning. They lose their sense of community. They lose their spiritual center.
Yeah,
they live longer.
Exactly.
They live longer, but without a spiritual center.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So now your research, you've written non-fiction books, some fiction books as well, in many other things. I know you have a interesting book on the Cold War and spies and things as well.
Yes.
But in terms of your research on these esoteric traditions, the pagan tradition, and there is a difference between them, which you may want to elaborate. But you did work on the Rosicrucians, which you spoke a little bit about. Eliphas Levi, who was a very interesting and important person. You've written your latest book, Beyond the North Wind, about Hyperborea. Very, very interesting. Can you just elaborate a little bit on your work and what the unrecognized importance of these things have been to history? Because it seems very obscure that these things are okay. They're very it's very interesting, but not very important. But in fact, they do have some important significance in the way history has unfolded. And if you'd like to elaborate on that for us, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, well, what's always interested me as a historian is the interface between history and myth, the way that history is always turning into myth, and myth drives history very often. I mean, a classic case of that is the virtual deification of Princess Diana after her death, to the extent that some people even want to rename the planet Earth as the planet Diana. So
Sounds kind of Greek, actually.
yes, it does. Yes, yeah. So this is at the level of national heroes. You see this process that I'm talking about. How a person can almost overnight become a mythologized figure.
Yes.
When you when you look at these esoteric traditions, something like the Rosicrucian tradition, you see, has had an enormous influence in all kinds of ways. It's had an influence in the arts, in music. The French composer Eric Satie was a Rosicrucian. He was a leading member of a group called the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross in France, and some of his music is influenced by Rosicrucianism. It's had an influence in science, in medicine. For example, the homeopathic tradition basically comes out of Rosicrucianism.
Okay.
Because there was a group in Germany that I wrote about in my doctoral thesis called the Golden and Rosy Cross, who practiced alchemy.
Right.
And it was out of that whole milieu that the homeopathic tradition was developed.
Yes.
And homeopathy is still a form of medicine that's very widely practiced today. And of course, it's influenced fiction and poetry, and that's one example of an esoteric tradition that's had a very significant influence.
Yes. And then people like Eliphas Levi, a very interesting person, could be controversial as well for some, but certainly very very significant, but unknown.
Yes, well, he is very interesting, and some of his ideas, for example, influenced Madame Blavatsky.
Yes.
Eliphas Levi had the concept of the astral light, which was a kind of universal, all-pervading energy or field. And Madame Blavatsky took up this term, the astral light, and she talked about the astral body and so on. And
I mean, he was a very committed socialist as well.
Yes, he was.
And this was before Marx, if I understand, right? It's the early 19th century, correct?
Well, interestingly enough, one of his books called The Testament of Liberty, Le Testament de la Liberté, appeared at exactly the same time as Marx's Communist Manifesto.
Okay.
And that's quite significant, because that was a point where the socialist movement could have gone in two different directions.
Yes.
It could have gone down the sort of spiritual, esoteric direction, or it could have gone down the Marxist secular direction, which in fact it did. But if it had gone down the direction of Levi, we'd have a very different type of socialism today.
Yeah, because Marx's theory, what he called it, was dialectical materialism. He was very clear that he was and I mean, then when you go, I think his PhD thesis was on Democritus versus Epicurus. So going back into Greek philosophy about materialism versus metaphysical non-materialism. So he was very, very clear that he was a vulgar materialist, if you want to put it that way, and on all the epiphenomenon of consciousness and these things were merely an outgrowth of materialism. And today we see this in the debates on consciousness and science. Like what's that guy, Dan? Oh, I can't remember his surname. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but people who believe matter, I mean, consciousness comes from matter, so the brain produces consciousness. And this is where the whole AI debate is coming. They believe that a computer can become conscious one day. And again,
Yeah,
this is from a totally materialist
yeah,
interpretation.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Mm.
And so I find that very interesting. Elphas, did you ever check on he's probably has some influence to Nietzsche as well, I would think. Have you ever explored that?
No,
Yeah.
interesting thought, but I don't know.
Yeah. Because Crowley's "Do It Thou Wilt" seems to me very much like Nietzschean morality, and
Yes, although
and
he
Crowley
actually,
is directly plugged into Levy, that's for sure.
well, Crowley actually got that from Rabelais.
Okay,
It comes in Rabelais. In one of Rabelais' books, he talks about the temple of Thelema, the temple of,
yes,
which became Crowley's religion.
motto. Yes.
Yeah, motto. Yeah.
Yeah, and then your latest book, which is very interesting because even India, I don't know where the origin comes from, but certainly I know Indian intellectuals and mystics and gurus and people and they crossed over into Indian nationalism, Indian politics, just like today. You have that, but the idea of Hyperborea and you've written on that. Why don't you
well,
expand on it a bit?
one of the most interesting figures is the Indian writer Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was writing around the early 20th century. He was an Indian nationalist.
He was a member of the Indian National Congress too, wasn't he?
Yes, and he was even imprisoned for a time by the British.
Yeah, and Gandhi looked up to him very much, and I think he blessed Gandhi when Gandhi first came in politics. Yeah.
Well, Tilak wrote a very interesting book called what was it? What was the title? It's something like the Aryan home in the Vedas.
Right.
Where he puts forward the theory that the Indo-Europeans, in fact, had a homeland in the far north, in the Arctic region, and he argues the case for this quite interestingly. He claims that there was this Arctic, the Arctic homeland. I think it's called the. Anyway, he claims that this was many thousands of years ago, about 40,000 years ago, before the Arctic region became covered by ice, and that the Indo-Europeans, in fact, migrated out from this center. So there's a lot of interest in Tilak's work today.
So was he the first one to articulate that idea?
No, other people had articulated it in a different way. There was an American writer, Warren something. I've forgotten his full name.
Right.
He argued something rather similar.
Right.
So Tilak wasn't the first.
Right.
There are all kinds of interesting connections between the Indian Vedic tradition and the Nordic Scandinavian tradition.
Yes.
I mean, for example, you have the Vedic sky god Dios, who became Tios in the, or Toit in the Germanic Nordic tradition.
Right.
And from that we get the word Deutsch.
Okay.
And also,
Theos, right,
yeah,
right.
and also the word Deus, Latin word Deus, meaning God, and Zeus, the Greek god.
And the Greek word Theos.
Theos, exactly. Yes.
Theology.
Yeah, and then there's the Vedic god Indra, who's the god of force and fire, and storm and rain, who has a thunderbolt.
Yes.
So he's the exact counterpart to Thor in the Nordic tradition. So the question is, did the did the Nordic mythology come out of India, or did both come from some common source?
Yes.
And I tend to take the latter view.
Right. Yeah.
So
I'll tell you just something that I discovered in my own research and looking at all these things, because I just find it fascinating, all these links between Indian Vedic culture and different traditions in the West. Like, for example, even the calculation of Easter is exactly the calculation of Holi. It's about the first full moon in the spring solstice. And then you have Vasant Panchami for the Hindus, and it's the same thing for Lent, 40 days before that. And then you have the fasting and the incense, and then you have the ashes on the forehead, which is which is so Hindu. And then even the days of the week, I always wondered why 7 days. I'm still not 100% satisfied on my investigation on why 7, but in the naming of the 7, I was starting to look into that. I've heard people talk about the Babylonian tradition and whatnot, but that hasn't satisfied me. But the names of the days, I really like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I started to look into that. And Sunday, the day of the sun, French, I know it's dimanche. And then and in Hindi it's Ravivar, and Ravi is god of the sun. And so okay, I saw that link, Ravivar, Sunday. Monday, moon. French, I know lundi, which is the moon, and moon's day. And then in Hindi it is Somvar, and that is for the moon. And then I said, wait, this is getting a little bit coincidental. So Tuesday, I said, look, let me check out Tuesday. Tuesday, all right, is the Norse god Tu.
yes.
And the god of war. And that's Mars. In French, they say Mardi, so the god of war. And in Hindi, it's Mangalvar. Mangal is Mars, the god of war.
Oh, really?
Wait. Let me go. Let me continue this. Wednesday. All right. Let's see. What is Wednesday? So Wednesday, Wotan's day.
Yes.
Wotan is Odin, and as a tricks. No. Wotan, not Odin.
Yes.
Yeah. Is Odin, right? And in French, it's Mercredi, which is Mercury. And Mercury is a trickster god, and I believe Odin is seen as a trickster god, right? And then in Hindi, it's I'm forgetting the name, but that's the day you worship Mercury, the planet Mercury. So then I went, okay, well, Thursday, I know that's Thor's day, and then
Friday.
Yes, and in Hindi it's the same thing. It's the worship of Saturn on that day. No, that's Saturday. Sorry.
Friday is Freya.
Yes, Freya, which is Venus.
Exactly. Yes.
And that is what you worship on for the Hindus as well. And then Saturn on Saturday. And I saw that the Norse tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Roman tradition, every day was the exact same god that was worshipped, the same planet, the same god. Not only is it astronomical, it's metaphysical, theological, and that there are these profound links that persist to today. Did you find that in other links like that, or that itself?
Absolutely. It's amazing how many people don't realize that the days of the week in English are named after the Nordic gods. You know, if you say, well, Thursday is named after Thor, and Friday is named after Freya, the Nordic Venus.
Yes.
It's amazing how many people don't know that.
That's right. I forgot. So, Shivani's reminding me, Wednesday is Budvar. That's right. And Bud is Mercury. Bud is, that's the planet Mercury. Right?
Yes,
and then, Thursday is Shukravar. And and that is Yeah, yeah. It's amazing.
Well,
Um,
another way in which the Nordic mythology has influenced our culture is the legend that the stork brings children into the world.
right.
Now, the stork in Old Norse is called Adabar, or Odabar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Od is a kind of invisible force, similar to prana in the Indian
Mm-hmm.
tradition.
Yeah.
So it's the force of life. It's the invisible force of
Right.
life. So, and bar means to bear or carry. So the Adabar or Udabar is the carrier of the life force.
Ah.
And in the mythology, there's the world tree, the Yggdrasil,
Mm-hmm.
and at the foot of the Yggdrasil are three fountains or springs or pools, and in one of them, the the new souls wait to be incarnated,
Yeah.
and they're waiting there, um, sort of shielded in water lilies, and the stork comes and takes a new soul, and then puts it into the womb of the future mother.
Yes.
So that's the origin of this
And
legend.
I can empathize with you in terms of the way it's so grounded in nature, in the plants,
Yes,
in the animals, in the whole atmosphere of Europe, of Northern Europe, of your people. You know,
yes,
I feel that as well when I look into, you know, Indian history and and the little bit of research I've done into Amerindian history in
mm,
the Caribbean is very interesting. All
mm.
our native animals, like the hummingbird, we're the land of the hummingbird in Trinidad. It's
Oh,
such a
yeah,
magical animal, the way it flies around and it could stay stationary. No other
yes,
bird is like that. That was supposed to be a special messenger of the gods. And these wild animals that we use as wild meat here, agouti and lapin, all of
mm,
them are featured so heavily in the mythology of the Amerindians. And you know,
mm,
the place was sacred to them, you know.
yeah,
I totally understand that
mm,
from what you're talking about in your story. and
yeah,
and Christianity. Oh, so you know, just one thing to complete the days of the week. I just saw the message. Yeah, Thor related to Zeus. Zeus, the Roman name is Jupiter, and on Shukravar, Thursday, the Hindus worship the planet Jupiter. So
mm,
it
mm,
is a one-to-one correlation there, just to complete that.
yes,
But
mm,
to get back to the European tradition, this groundedness in, you know, and all these religions,
mm,
whether it be Hinduism or Amerindian religions in the Caribbean, or the pre-Christian religions of Northern Europe, so related and entwined with the environment. And this is, I think, why, you know, Western Christianity, when it converted the Europeans to Christianity, incorporated the Easter Bunny, incorporated the Yuletide traditions, because they're not in the Bible. These are
mm,
old pre-Christian
mm,
traditions that were brought in, bringing in your tree into a house and decorating it, the
mm,
Yule log, all and it's incredible. I mean, to this day, how you know, there are branches of Christianity which I'm sure you're well aware of. You know, Protestant Christianity that condemn Roman Catholicism for being pagan because of all of that.
yeah, yes,
Um, you know, I'd be interested to hear your take on the role of Christianity in Europe. I've had some interesting discussions with people like E. Michael Jones,
mm,
um,
oh, yes,
and
yes,
E.
yes,
Michael Jones has talked about. He said his ancestors are German. He said our ancestors were chasing pigs in the mud before Christianity came, and Christianity is what made Europe Europe, and so he is very um, uh, solid in that it was Christianity that civilized Europe
mm,
and
mm,
made Europeans what today we understand as
yes,
Europeans, which is kind of the position of the Catholic Church. And I understand the argument, but
mm,
I'd like to hear your your view of it, because I know there's another counter view, which I always find interesting, about how, you know, Christianity is an imperialist religion in Europe as well, because in the third world and third world nationalism, that's been an argument for a long time. Christianity is a way of imperialism, and it's a way for Europeans to colonize the third world and Asia, Latin America, Africa. They came with the gun in one hand and the Bible in the other, and inquired for gold. But that history may also be the history of Europe as well, in the suppressing of all these traditions. And that we talked about secret societies. The reason why they're secret is because they were suppressed. So I'd like to hear your view of it, being, you know, an expert researcher. I think it would be very valuable.
Well, you see, this touches on one of the reasons why I'm a pagan. It has to do with that circular thinking that I mentioned earlier, as against the straight line linear thinking, because this linear thinking that you get in the monotheistic religions has become transferred to other realms. This idea that everything has to move forward in a straight line. This has become transferred to the secular realm. It's become transferred to the realm of the arts, the realm of architecture, so that
economics,
yes.
Yeah.
So
history.
You're not allowed to refer back to tradition or to the past. Everything has to be forward-looking. And so you see this in the realm of art, for example. I regard most modern art as a disaster. And
yes, agreed.
Not to mention architecture. I mean, we've never had so much technological capacity to create beauty, but instead we create ugliness everywhere.
Right.
We fill our cities with hideous buildings that nobody wants to be surrounded by. It's all part of this linear paradigm.
Yes.
So now, when J. Michael Jones says his ancestors were, how did he put it, living in pigsties?
Yeah, they were chasing pigs. He said, my ancestors were chasing pigs in the forests of Germany.
Yes, well, this is, you see, presupposes that somebody who is chasing pigs is backward and primitive.
Yes.
The fact that they weren't living in the houses they were living in may have looked a bit primitive from the outside. They may have been built of turf or built of logs with a turf roof, you know, rather primitive looking. But that doesn't mean that it was a primitive society. And you can see that when you look at prehistoric sites. You see, one of the things that I was taught when I was studying history at school was that civilization basically spread from the south to the north.
Right.
That it all started somewhere around what is now Iraq, and then went via the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, and then further and further north. And then the great breakthrough came with Christianization, and we've never looked back.
Yes.
Whereas I see it completely differently. According to that view, the early inhabitants of Northern Europe were written off as primitive barbarians. I remember at school being taught, the only thing I remember being taught about the ancient Britons was that they dyed their skins blue with a substance called woad. So I used to imagine these blue-skinned figures sort of moving through the misty forests of Britain, grunting to each other in some primitive language.
Right.
But later on, I discovered that this picture is completely wrong. Now, if you look at sites like Stonehenge, the amount of astronomical and mathematical knowledge that went into the building of Stonehenge, not to mention the feat of bringing those stones to where they are. And the Callanish stones in Lewis, or recently, or not recently, but back in the 1990s, a site was discovered in an astronomical observatory was discovered in Germany, which is apparently 7,000 years old.
Wow.
Well, that's
and then even things like I can't remember what they're called, but you know, there's like a figure of a woman that you could only see from very high aerial views.
Yes.
In the ground. You know what I'm talking about? I think
No.
where
is that?
I believe it's in England. I
England.
believe it. I thought it was Scotland. I could be wrong, but it's these it's you know, it's kind of like crop circles, except these are ancient, and it's like a figure of a woman.
Oh, right? I think you're talking about the Callanish stones. Yes.
Could be.
Yes. When you look at the
Yeah, and it can only be seen at extremely high altitudes with planes or not even from a hill. It has to be, you know, from the air. How could you, you know, that is, you know, incredible.
Yeah.
So we were talking about all this, all these achievements of these ancient peoples, and contradicting the idea of them being primitive. So continue,
exactly. So I don't really buy the idea that the Christianization was made us civilized, so to speak.
Right. And for some people, I'm always interested. I'm fascinated by Julian the Apostate in Rome.
Yes.
Who tried to bring Rome back to the old gods, and you know, there are people who argue that, you know, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was due to its Christianization, and that they lost the old Roman manly virtues. And later on, you know, people like Nietzsche certainly brought that up. He thought Christianity was a disaster for Europe in his view. He preferred the Greco-Roman traditions, and I believe Machiavelli also was of that opinion. And this point of view was very much it very much was, at least in the background, maybe not allowed to be said publicly, but for many European intellectuals, you know, they revered the pagan Greco-Roman tradition over the traditions of their day, which are predominantly Christian, and they saw it as as a bad thing. Do you share that view, or what's your view?
Well, the interesting thing is that even an ultra-Catholic monarch like Louis XIV of France filled his gardens with pagan images.
Yes.
And in Italy, there were even cardinals who filled their gardens with these images of pagan gods and goddesses.
Well, look at the cathedrals and the gargoyles.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So I think there's a sort of undercurrent of paganism that continued right through the history of Europe.
Yes. You were going to say something?
Well, I wrote a sort of a novella called "The Master of the Starlit Grove."
Mm-hmm.
It's in this collection here.
Okay.
Right. And this puts forward the idea that there was a pagan egregore that was created at the time when the Christianization started.
Right.
And this pagan egregore was created as a sort of ark to preserve the pagan consciousness until the time when it could reemerge and be reborn.
Yeah, you know, I was raised a Catholic. My father is Catholic and my mother's Hindu. and there's still a lot about Catholic theology that I like very much. In particular, Catholicism roots itself in the idea of natural law, which is fascinating, and that distinguishes it from fundamentalist Christianity. And, however, it always frustrates me, sometimes amuses me, when they talk about paganism and pagan values in a negative way and talk about the materialism, so when they talk about when they talk about moral degeneracy and when they talk about materialism, they refer to paganism, right? So they call that pagan. And so they will use that word in certain contexts, and I find that very unfortunate, obviously. But I do think that the history of European colonialism was very much part of the same linear history that you're talking about, and that we were speaking with Reza Georgiani about this a couple weeks ago, talking about well, he seems very proud and pleased about that, which is fine, but that the Iranian Mithraic, I don't know if Manichaeanism is part of it, but certainly it's in the family of that idea of the linear history of the Messiah was an Iranian Aryan contribution which changed the world. I agree, but I don't think it changed it for the better. But it did change the world, and I didn't get into the debate with him because he talked about the linear history and the teleology of history, and I just mentioned that the problem with the teleologists is that they always get the end wrong. They always think the world is going to end now, but it's actually rather circular. So, but I do think that the history of Christianity in Europe, not only was it suppressing of European pre-Christian traditions, and it may have been imperialist within Europe, but certainly it was imperialist outside of Europe. And I wonder how much of the sort of revival of paganism and pagan ethos and pre-Christian ideas and whatnot would actually contribute to a more harmonious, anti-imperialist sort of world. Sorry, which is why I put that in the title. I incorporated anti-imperialism in the title of today's talk because I see there's some kind of connection there in my own mind. How about you? What do you think?
Oh yeah, well, I think you can see that for example in Eastern Europe, because during the time of the Soviet bloc, these local pagan traditions, for example, in the Baltic states, were very much suppressed by the communists.
Right.
And the pagan traditions were very much bound up with the local culture, folk traditions, folk songs, and all of that, folk tales,
folk medicines, all these sorts of things.
Folk medicine, all of that. And this was very much suppressed by the communists. And one of the ways in which those countries like Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia kept alive their national consciousness was by, for example, singing these songs, these folk songs, which had a very strong pagan component. And of course, when the Soviet bloc broke up and communism collapsed, it all came up again, and so now these traditions are now flourishing again in those countries. So I think this is an example of what you're talking about.
Yes, I think so. I think it has to do with rooting ourselves in our ancestral traditions, in our lands.
Exactly, yes.
and not trying to externalize it, and not trying to impose our traditions on other people, and
No,
recognizing
no.
that every people have their own traditions,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
which are worthy of being preserved and honored and
yeah.
cared for. It might not be your tradition, but
Mm.
it's somebody's tradition, and
Yes, yes,
they each have their wisdom, and
yes,
we
yes,
can all learn from each other's wisdom, and we each have a responsibility for our own ancestral traditions to keep it alive, because who else would do it
yeah.
if we don't, right? We
That's
can't.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yes, yes, yes. Well,
Yes.
that was a
Mhm.
good thing about the Romans, because I mean the Romans conquered most of Western Europe and a large part of North Africa and the Middle East, but they didn't convert the people they conquered.
That's right.
They had no reason to.
Exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. Yeah. All they did was ask that you include one or two of their gods in your pantheon,
Yes, yes, yes.
basically.
They said, well, we call him Mercury, you call him Odin. So
Yeah,
what does it
and
matter? Yeah.
that's right.
Mm.
And this is so much part of certainly the Hindu tradition as well, and the whole Indo-European tradition. It goes back,
Mm.
and perhaps, you know, I suppose we're running out of time, so we can't spend too long on it. But I think the this idea that you have of in developing Hyperborea, and that civilization, you know, there may be a common root that's
Mm.
that we've lost and might
Mm.
be located in Hyperborea, and instead of civilization going from south to north, it might have come from north to south.
Mm.
What could you elaborate on that just a little? I mean, what sort of evidence and argumentation do you develop in your book about that idea that civilization may have come from this pre-ice age
Yeah.
northern homeland?
Well, there's a very interesting book by Jeffrey Ash
Mm-hmm.
called Ancient Wisdom, where he talks about the significance of the number 7, which you were mentioning earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and argues that it has to do with the constellation of the Great Bear,
Uh,
which which has 7 stars,
right.
and the constellation of the Little Bear, of course, has the pole star, the North Star.
That's right.
Um, so he argues that this is the real origin of the mystique attached to the number 7,
Mm.
and also the significance of the name bear, of the symbol of the bear,
Yeah.
because the word Arctic comes from the Greek word arctos, meaning bear, and
Ah.
the bear is a very very important symbol in the whole Nordic
Yeah.
tradition and culture, and in the Celtic tradition.
Yeah.
Uh,
And also in the Inuit tradition, I think, as well, which is interesting, right? I mean,
yes,
there are
yes,
non-Indo-European people, but a northern people as well, and the bear, yeah. So it's Ursa
yes,
Minor
yes.
and Ursa
Well,
Major. You're talking about the
well,
constellation.
the Inuit, of course, belong to the northern shamanic peoples, and
Yes.
that's another interesting aspect to all of this, because if you go around the Arctic Circle,
Mm-hmm.
say starting in Iceland, you have the Inuit from Greenland all the way around to Alaska,
Yeah.
and then you have the various Mongol peoples of Siberia, the Buryat and the Yakut and
Right.
so on, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have the Sami in northern Scandinavia,
Yeah.
and all of these peoples are shamanic,
Yes. 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 Yes.
and there's a strong shamanic element in the Nordic tradition. For example, the idea that Odin um, sacrificed himself by hanging on the Yggdrasil, the world tree,
Mm-hmm.
and in that way he gained the secret of the runes. Well, this is a shamanic ordeal,
Right. Yes. Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
there are many other shamanic elements, totem animals, and so on. So the Nordic mythology is full of shamanic features.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our program today. There's so many issues and ideas that you've written about and explored that I'd love to speak more about. Maybe we can in future. But for listeners and viewers who want to learn more about your work and your research, where can they find it?
Well, they can. The best thing is to go to my website, which is www.ozgard, OZGARD, .net.
Okay.
Ozgard.
I will put that in the link.
No, wait a minute. Sorry, I have to say that again.
Yes.
I have to say that again. McIntosh, McIntosh, McIntosh at Ozgard.net. That's
right.
it.
That's your email. I'm just checking and confirming. Ozgard.net is your
website. Yes.
Yeah. Good. All right. So I would encourage everybody who's interested in these topics. I mean, they are interesting in and of themselves, just as topics, but they are also very connected to the world around us in ways that we don't quite appreciate, and I would certainly recommend taking a look at the work of Christopher McIntosh. So thanks very much. I really appreciate you being on the program.
It's been a pleasure, Kirk.
Right. Well, that's it for this week's episode of A Story Club Global Cultures. We were talking with our guest Christopher McIntosh, author and researcher on the topic of European paganism, spirituality, and anti-imperialism. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for watching and listening. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, like, share, subscribe, and tell your friends about us. Thanks again, and see you next week.